and welcome to the GlassHouse webcast. Today's topic, the shifting data center, ensuring success amid risk and change, will be presented by Simon Johnson, GlassHouse's Director of Data Center Services. Simon has worked across all industry verticals in EMEA, the U.S., and Latin America, defining and delivering projects that focus on transforming the protection and alignment of data into a business value-aligned service. Simon's extensive architecture and implementation experience across data protection, storage, data center consolidation, and IT service delivery enables him to define innovative, complex solutions which meet today's challenging business needs. Just a few housekeeping notes. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Please use the questions pane to do so. We will be happy to email this presentation to you at the end of the call. And if you have questions after the webcast, please email them to me, and I will ensure that Simon follows up with you. Ladies and gentlemen, Simon Johnson.
Thanks, Natalia. So welcome everyone to the Shifting Data Center, Ensuring Success Amid Risk and Change. We're going to look at today from a topic perspective how IT plans for success with virtualization across the desktop and the server community, and how we're seeing all the changes through the provision of services evolving around the data center and really changing the data center as we've traditionally seen it into the emerging model that's very much based around the different cloud-based services and the virtualization of that infrastructure that goes within there. So we're going to look at that evolving model. We're going to look at why cloud is giving the end user more choices, and what and why those challenges are being presented to IT, and how IT can start to look at them. We're going to focus on the service provider model and how that gives a layer of governance and control towards the success of managing those changes and providing those different levels of services out to the community. And we're going to start to look at the new role that IT plays as part of that. So what do these changes mean to IT? How can they start to manage them and ensure ongoing quality of service while providing and integrating those new services into their offerings? We'll then finally look at some of the steps that GlassHouse take to transition you through that process and to ensure success while that change is occurring. So what are we seeing in terms of increasing demands on IT? Well, we're seeing it from two angles, both the short and long term in the form of strategic challenges that have been present within the data center and that I talk to about our customers daily, and the operational changes within that they're trying to tackle, as well as combining those with the strategic developments that the business wants them to drive. And they form into the areas you can see on the slide here. So from an enterprise architecture perspective, you've got the changing models that are occurring. You've got a lot of the industry press and change that's going on from transformation of the data centers to using cloud models and really starting to stretch the boundaries of traditional data centers. You've got the need within that for the application alignment, and the ever-increasing need really as you start to relinquish or potentially relinquish some of that control with these new strategies. And then you've got the challenges that brings about with the support with those new models and the support to match and align with business growth and agility. So as the business increases, demands ever-increasing service and service levels, how from a strategic enterprise architecture perspective is IT going to deal with that? From an operations side, there's the ongoing challenges with data center space and environmental, so there's the green issue, driving the consolidation and virtualization of infrastructure within that to meet those objectives. There's the ongoing cost reduction. For a long time, the IT budgets have been a challenge within organizations, and costs have always been to keep to minimum, keep on reducing those. So how are those challenges met with the increasing demands for growth and agility from the business? The lack of cost profile around that. So not only the costs been growing, there's a driver to start to reduce those. There's a desire to really bring those into a controlled and tangible fashion and increase the quality of reporting around that. And then that matches with the operational and financial metrics that go around it to aid the decision making. So how can IT start to clarify what those look like and become more predictable in terms of the capital expenditure and operational expenditure that they enforce on the environment? From an operational perspective, the technology is evolving rapidly. The application architecture is becoming ever more challenging, and we're seeing this in our end clients from both applications being developed for new types of data center models, be those private clouds or public clouds, and how that application stack is changing. We're looking at the infrastructure, or seeing the infrastructure changing rapidly underneath that. And that's not just from a base technology perspective, but from an orchestration, a management, and provisioning perspective. And we're seeing the ongoing challenge into the lack of visibility into the current environment. So what's within the data center? What do I have as a CIO or an IT director within my data center that's drawing down on my costs? What does that look like? Because I need to know what that looks like before I prepare for the change into new models. From a process perspective, there's a relative lack of maturity still in the best practice that goes around that. As a result, management's reactive and IT struggles to get into that proactive strategic state. And there's no ability to manage change without risk. So because of the lack of clarity around the environment, because of the lack of defined processes, the change comes with risk. And the change to the evolving data center model represents one of the most significant changes we've seen for a long time. And it really brings to the forefront that risk that exists within current environments. And from a people perspective, there's the ongoing challenges of reactive organizations, business as usual, consuming resources, and the challenges not only to manage internally the IT resources and the provisioning of IT as a service to the business, but then start to look strategically as to how organizations can take advantage of some of these developments that are going on in the marketplace at the moment. So what does that shift look like? Well, that shift is really end-to-end. It's not just occurring within the data center. It's starting at the end user, and it's coming into the data center in terms of the infrastructure that we're seeing within it. And then that's being driven by the value of the applications, the data that's being protected, and the desire to reduce the ongoing operational costs within IT and start to take advantage, strategic advantage of some of these initiatives to really optimize those options available and drive down the costs associated with. So on the left-hand side here of the screen, a lot of the customers I'm talking to at the moment are really evolving the way that their end users access the environment, and that that goes beyond just the traditional desktop and the virtualization of the desktop. That's starting to introduce the idea of bring your own device and new devices that are accessing data and applications within the data center. That gives the end user greater mobility, agility, time to market, better opportunities to get access and communicate with the organization, but it represents significant security risks and challenges as you start to go away from a honed, defined desktop environment and you start to push out the ability for end users to bring their own devices and to access your data center information and applications through those. So that control and governance that you typically had as an IT organization through having a standard desktop build or a standard desktop profile is shifting as that end user community is using new methods and new ways to access the information that sits within the data center and within the applications. From a data center infrastructure perspective, we've seen the evolution here from 1990 through to current state of dedicated environments that have been well planned for, that are siloed, that are built around risk mitigation, but ultimately are expensive and have caused utilization issues across the data center. And this has driven out the challenges around the size and footprint of the data center, the draw and power and environmental that's been associated with it. So we dropped down and we saw the evolution to tackle that utilization through a consolidation initiative led by virtualization across storage, across platform, and that consolidation of those assets, or those candidates that were best suited to that, from dedicated host to virtual host. We've subsequently seen the development of the cloud within that, and really cloud is leveraging from a private cloud perspective that same type of infrastructure stack, but it's really starting to shift the paradigm around how that's provisioned and orchestrated and how the end user interacts with the data center and with IT to gain access to those assets to use for application development. And then we've seen as part of that also the public clouds, the concept of pushing beyond the boundaries of just your organization's data, going completely away from the siloed, secure environment where you run it within your own walls to running it on shared infrastructure where other users are also using that compute power. They're on the same physical frames for storage, and you're really into an environment where efficiencies can be drawn and a utopian vision of efficiencies can be created in a shared environment where you have your data and applications residing on common infrastructure with a group of other organizations to drive up their utilization. All these factors have been driven by the desire to increase efficiency and reduce costs and increase agility to the organization to be able to react to business's ongoing demands of IT. So we see there the arrows increasing risk as you go up the stack from public cloud to dedicated hosts, and the dollar unit of provisioning going against those. The idea being that the applications that sit on the dedicated or virtual hosts have the greater expense associated with them, and as you shift down the stack towards the private public cloud, you can draw out greater efficiencies and therefore greater cost savings associated with it. And pretty much all of the conversations I'm having at the moment with my clients around data center migrations are based on cloud initiatives. So they have to migrate data centers, or they have to optimize current data center footprints, and they want to consider cloud within that. So that's driving, not only is it driving programs, but programs that are already in existence, it's forming a key and driving component within that.
Welcome to GoToWebinar.
So we're seeing it right now. We've been seeing for a number of years the drive towards cloud-based services, and we've seen a lot of interest in the market. A lot of it's been at the analyst level, and I've pulled out here some statistics moving forward. But we've seen within the user community now real adoption and real interest in adopting either private or public clouds for part or all of their infrastructure. And the shift towards it obviously very much depends on the type of industry in, how you're regulated, the size of organization, the maturity of processes you have. But moving forward, there's obviously significant expectation for that acceleration and adoption to increase. So some statistics here saying between 2010 and 2013, the cloud service market is expected to grow over 35%. Interestingly, 50% of global 1,000 enterprises will rely on external cloud computing services for the top 10 revenue generating processes by 2015. So the concept that the cloud is really only for the SMB and medium-sized organizations is going to be going away as the industry matures and can start to take on more critical systems in a controlled environment once that maturity has been adopted within the providers. 15% of current worldwide desktops are going to be migrated to virtual desktops, so a huge driver there by 2014. By 2012, 50% of CIOs, the Global 1000, will be using cloud computing to measure and track their internal service costs, which is a 5% increase, a 5 times increase when compared with 2008. By 2012, infrastructure utility and cloud-based services will account for at least 50% of the demand for managed IT, and by 2012, cloud brokerage services will grow by more than 30%. So the current trend that we're seeing in significant interest and early adopters into the cloud model is expected to significantly increase. These comments here are from the analysts such as ESG, Gartner, Butler Group, who are providing statistics around where CIO's interest is and where IT departments are looking to shift and how aggressively they are anticipating the adoption of that shift. Recently, the White House issued a statement that was talking about leveraging both data center consolidation and cloud computing as a significant cost-saving enabler into 2012. We'll expect a target savings of around $3 billion. So the interest and the view for adoption to cloud services is holistic and moves above and beyond the lower level services of the early adopters that are currently there. And what does that cloud landscape look like? Well, it comes into really 3 high-level areas. You've got the options for your infrastructure as a service model, which brings in all the different infrastructure components that we've traditionally seen within a data center. The virtual desktop makes its entrance into the data center at this point, which is a change to traditional IT with that desktop sitting outside the data center. That's now coming into the data center and being managed as a component with the associated service levels and availability targets that previously had only been seen with applications and supporting servers. We've got virtual servers sitting within there in the IaaS models, and we've got the storage and associated compute power to provide the infrastructure for the applications then to sit on within those models. We then have the next step from that, which is the platform as a service. So how can I actually provision an entire platform and application up at that level so end users can start to develop as part of that common toolset? So not only am I providing the infrastructure that's within there, I'm providing functionality around software for development and configuration environments that go beyond just purely the infrastructure stack. I then have software as a service at the highest level there. So the different pieces of software that can be offered out to end user communities, ready to use and consume on a utility or an agreed per use model, depending on the different contracts that are there. But these are around pushing out systems like CRM, ERP and messaging, and how they can be used straight away as applications available to the end user without the need for detailed design or setup or configuration. They're applications that are presented and ready to be used and customized for the end user as they desire. So really three areas that are shifting the traditional view and siloed view of IT and offering up different types of services for both the end user and IT to start to consume those in a different model from an architecture and presentation perspective. So what's this all meaning to the end user? Well, it's really starting to mean that the end user no longer has to just go to IT to get their services. It's increasing their choice. I have customers who are facing challenges of development arms going out to cloud service providers, be it from an IaaS model, a PaaS model, or a SaaS model, to get what they need to do their development. And the reason they're going out to do it is for the agility and the time to market that it gives them. So it's breaking that traditional control that IT have had. And it's opening IT to open market forces and the challenges that those traditional provisioning cycles have met and that their end users have had to live with to date, but now have options to move out and above and beyond this. It also gives IT the ability to expand its portfolio, to start to look at how can I start to deliver these services that the business is demanding both within my data center and external to that, starting to leverage these different models. So it's giving choice to both the end user and to IT to increase services and go-to-market capability and identify where they are best met in order to deliver those services at the right price points, to the right levels that are needed within the organization. The challenge that's presenting is a governance challenge. It's presenting a governance and data security challenge, not only from the perspective that the end user can have access to these end providers without going through IT, but also from IT now providing a service that they have less control of. So it starts to shift their paradigm from building out services based on an agreed set of objectives, based on project requirements and parameters, and then developing the architecture internally using either common models or agreed technologies that IT have gone out, looked through, designed and developed, to a model where you are relying on a third party to provide those services and really to deliver the quality of service that you have been delivering internally without you understanding necessarily what's behind that, what the levels of service truly can be delivered, because you're no longer in control of the architecture behind it. So it's changing the model for not only the end user, but it's also changing the model for IT as they start to expand their service capability and start to rely or move out to third parties to provide some of those traditional core siloed internal services. So challenges there from both ends. And what's driving that change? Well, driving the change is coming from the top half of this slide, so the current user experience. From an end user perspective, traditional IT has had lengthy time to provision. There's been a lack of visibility in service levels, and that inflexibility in the infrastructure and process has caused frustration. Couple that with the cost consumption consideration, the fact that end users frequently aren't charged for, or end business units aren't charged for the consumption of IT assets. You've had a model that from an end user and business community perspective has led at times to frustration through the time to provision, and you've led to an over-demand from the end user to over-provision from IT the levels of service and technology associated with those levels of service to drive those. From an IT perspective, it's led to the challenges we've seen around the data center. So data center sprawl and utilization issues, the lack of defined service levels around those. So IT has, in the majority, worked as a provider of technology, not a provider of service. And that's resulted in the lack of defined service levels there. It's had siloed environments and lack of tools to manage those. So this has led to the poor utilization and the data center sprawl that's occurred as a result of that. There's a lack within IT, there's a lack of unit cost visibility. So it works as a cost center, but the ability to effectively plan, manage, and predict cost has been hugely challenging. And it's hugely challenging because trying to understand requirements and capacity planning predictions from the end user has been challenging from IT. So they've remained technology-centric, not service-centric. And this has led to the frustration within the organization of the scale and growth of IT, and also the end user to get the infrastructure they need to start to deliver their application functionality and business functions up to the organization. So this is, from a finance perspective, resulted in the end user having no direct ROI correlation for the business, a difficulty and a challenge to understand how services are being consumed, where the spend is occurring, is the spend occurring in the right place, are the systems that are important to the business receiving the correct investment, because often that is occurring without any regard for the value that those applications represent to the business and the value those business systems represent. So there's a lack of visibility into that makeup. All of these components across the end user, the IT community, and finance have really driven the requirements in the lower half of this slide for the cloud user experience. So what does that mean from those three different areas? Well, from an end user, it's the idea that I can immediately get what I want and I can self-provision that. It means I know the service levels that are associated with it, so I can start to select correctly the service that I need, and I can get the infrastructure I need to deliver those services. So that agility and that scalability gives the end user the ability to meet the business demands and provide us the direction is coming from the end user, the predictable costs associated with it. From an IT perspective, it means that they can start to evolve towards service-aligned infrastructure and service-aligned infrastructure that's aligned to business decisions. There's asset utilization and accountability as part of that, because the end users are selecting and aligning the different qualities and levels of service associated with the applications they're developing and the relative business value associated with them. This enables the optimization infrastructure and the improved infrastructure efficiency, because you're starting to consolidate that infrastructure and not develop on a program basis in a siloed fashion. The efficiencies and utilization increases that occur as a result can be driven from that. It also means that you have known costs at the unit level. So from this perspective, you have a service, you're moving towards a service-centric model, and you're aligning that to common architecture and consolidated architecture components, and you're building out the costs as part of that. So your maturity in terms of known costs and costs at the unit level is significantly increased. From a finance perspective, you've got business-driven ROI for IT resources. You have IT resources correctly aligned to the value that that application, that business service represents to the organization. You have financial models that are understood and can present business justification. You've got efficiency and automation to reduce the headcount within IT, and you have the variable cost models on a pay-per-use model that really enable maturity of the cost-conscious decision-making around the provision, selection, and development of IT assets. So you've got the two paradigms here. You've got the current user experience, and you've really got the desired user experience that cloud is touting as being able to deliver as part of the evolution into a model that really aligns those services more effectively and drives efficiency out of the infrastructure associated with it. So these two factions that are driving that change and driving the selection of the two different models into organizations. So what does this mean to IT? Well, it's really an inherent shift in IT and how they work today. So right now, IT work as an organization that provision and manage assets. They have a plan, build, run methodology, and they develop it as siloed traditional organization models that is project-driven. So project requirements come from the business, they come to IT, those are designed, and then a set of architectural building blocks are created around those to provision the levels of service that are needed for that infrastructure. So we have in the bottom half of the slide here the governance that can occur at this level from IT because they are in control of the provisioning process. Third parties can be used for the design, but once again this is controlled as projects within the IT community. The development occurs and then the delivery of those operations on the infrastructure that sits within the data center is developed, and those applications and services are then presented out to the business, and the demand comes from the business to evolve those and increase those as that demand comes on. So you've got a very controlled, governed policy originally that has been project-based and driven and controlled by IT. How that role is changing is that IT is going from the provider of managed assets to a service broker for the enterprise. No longer with cloud services is it the case that internal IT is the only answer. There are the service models that we've looked at around infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service that really mean that IT and the end user have more choices. So that means that IT shift from the provider of their services to the service broker. They're supply chain orientated within IT infrastructure, and they're service catalog driven and measured on value. So the challenge that IT has within here is to start to leverage these different components and these evolutions within the data center to identify the most efficient ways of delivering those services and to go from a technology provider to a service-centric provider of services. So they're shifting the way they work to really act as a level of governance and control to align the requirements of the business to the correct models, be they internal or external. And that's driven on the bottom right-hand side from the service catalog and service portfolio management that we're going to come on to in a minute as one of the key areas of success around managing the correct alignment of those services. So when you start to look at an organization as to what are the right choices for you, one of the first steps to doing so is to really understand the makeup of your services and applications and understand the value they represent to the organization. The models we've gone through in the slide show different types of profiles that are suited to different types of applications. What we're seeing in the industry really is a recognition that the hybrid models for cloud are the ones that are driving the most significant adoption. So that means that some of your applications as a service will remain on siloed infrastructure, some will go into a private cloud, and then others that have burst type profiles will move into a public cloud type model. So to understand which of your applications is best suited to which model, you need to understand those applications. You need to understand the mapping of those applications through the different layers to the data center. So it's not just understanding the value they represent, but also the makeup within your existing organization for those. Because when you've aligned them to the correct level of service, you then have to migrate them. And to migrate them, you need to understand those applications, you need to understand the interdependencies that exist between them, and you need to ensure that not only you're aligning the correct level of service, but you're providing the governance associated with the migration of those assets into a new model, be that internally within your organization or externally to a new service provider. And from a GlassHouse perspective, we really feel the success or the successful steps into cloud models is driven and cannot be achieved without the service provider model. So traditional IT has been very technology-centric. It's been governed on a per-project basis. IT have had the requirements feed in from the business units. They've been able to design infrastructure based on either an agreed subset that they have within their technology stack or introducing new technology based on that project and align it to well-known and defined metrics around availability, performance, and quality of service. The service provider model starts to consolidate what those service levels are and create a common set of services from IT. So different levels of service that can be provided within common tiers that the business then can come into and align to. And this is the key, one of the key pieces to achieving success within the adoption of cloud models, to build out that model, to understand what those service levels are, rationalize and align your applications to those, and then define the infrastructure that goes underneath those. And that'll form the base building block of the scale-centric services that you need to have for cloud, because it'll enable the alignment of the application to the correct service levels, and then it'll design the correct infrastructure, be it internal or external, against those. So what does the service provider model mean, and what is involved within it? Well, the four components here on the slide map out the elements of the service provider model. So it has a service catalog, it has service level agreements, it has policy and procedure, and it has costs associated with those. So the service provider model is the inherent concept that's been around in GlassHouse since the early 2000s of transforming IT into service-centric operations. So look at the service levels that are needed from the organization, map out those service levels, and form that agreement with the organization. The organization or the end user being the recipient of those services and IT being the provision of those services. Once you've baselined what they are, you can publish those to the organization, and end users, when they require new services, can come and look at a catalog and look at the levels of service they need, look at the price points of those levels of service, and align their requests to those. So pulling those in and agreeing those service levels educates the end user as to the different levels of service that IT can provide and at which price point. And this enables IT then to build out the bottom level and look at the different architecture and service provider components that make those up and make the most efficient selection and choice of those for the IT service stack. There's then a provisioning process associated with that. So once those services are agreed and those service levels are established, how does the provisioning work within it? And there's the alignment of the costs to it. And those aren't only the alignment of the costs of the future state, but they're the alignment of the costs for the current state. Because to make a choice as to whether moving out from traditional services to cloud-based services is the correct one, you need to understand not only how do your applications match your service levels, but at what price point, and does it make sense then to move those out based on that alignment and price point that occurs as a result of that. So expanding on the service catalog, what are the base tenets of a service catalog? Well, it's a service-centric framework. It identifies the service levels that you as a service provider are issuing to the end user. It matches infrastructure and service delivery models to those service levels. So it creates levels of service that have infrastructure and infrastructure models associated with it and identifies the relevant price points of those. And it gives visibility in a common format to the end user of those. And it's not limited to just new services, it's across the stack. It's a comprehensive list of services that IT can now offer out to the organization, be those traditional, virtualized infrastructure within your data center, private clouds or public clouds, and it formalizes the service level agreements around that. So me, as an end user within your organization, could look at that service catalog and say, I know the types of service I need, I know the quality of service I need, I know the relative availability, and I know the price point that I'm willing to pay for that. I can then choose within that service catalog that service level I want without being aware or needing to know of the underlying infrastructure that's supporting that. Fundamental to it, as I said, is building up your costs and understanding what those costs are in a fully burdened format for the current state and the future state. It only makes sense from an IT organization's perspective to go out to external services if the costs are known internally and the service levels are known. That's not to say the only reason to go out to services is cost-based, because I'm seeing a lot of driver for the cloud being from an agility perspective and a time-to-market perspective from the organization. But to build out your service provider model, you want to understand what those price points are. So when you present and publish those services out to the organization, you do so not only from a service level perspective, but you do also from a price perspective. And when the end user then makes their selection, they know those key attributes around the service that's being provided and what it's costing them to consume or what it's costing the organization to provide it. So the mapping out of the costs underneath those service levels forms and completes the service catalog to enable the provision of those services and the price points of those services. This slide just goes through some of the tenets of those, how those services map through the data center and up to the service provider information level, and it gives a view of building the fully burdened cost for providing services to the end user. Once you have the service catalog in place, you then need to control the service provision. And this is, from a process perspective, a consistent approach and a central point of access and control to interact with the service catalog and feed the demand forecasting and capacity management into the requirements. It's underpinned by defined roles and responsibilities and the time frames that are expected and agreed with the organization around it. So it's formalizing the request and provisioning process around those services once they've been established. And these are the elements that need to be built above the infrastructure stack to then enable that service provisioning, reporting, management and maintenance to occur in a controlled process fashion on the back end that can then either be automated with different tool sets in the reference architectures that I'm about to show you, or defined within process and organization so the end user can move away from the frustration of not understanding what those published service levels are, not understanding the time frames that they have to wait for assets and infrastructure and services to be provided to them, but rather they have a predefined set of services that are made available to them within a time scale that they understand, and it gives IT the ability to forecast the demand and plan for the capacity associated with that. So really the service provider model controls the service selection, and it does so holistically. It starts to map out the infrastructure layer, because once I've built the service levels that I need to provide to the organization, I can start to look at the different attributes from an infrastructure layer and the different architectures that I need to provision as part of that. It tells me the service levels I need to build to, and therefore from an IT perspective it gives me the metrics that I need to build the architecture out around resilience, around performance and around quality of service. It tells me what I need to do from a provider management perspective. So from my orchestration and provisioning layer, it tells me what I need to do within what time frames, how I'm going to handle the service request management, how I'm going to handle config management and image life cycle, how I'm going to monitor those, how I'm going to deal with the licensing capacity performance. So it builds out the underlying processes from which these architectures can be built and from which the different technologies that play in here can be selected. And it provides my consumer management layer. So my service catalog play a key component in there to be able to provide service levels, to be able to show the price points of those service levels, so mature and accelerate my accounting and billing capability, to manage my customer expectations with a pre-defined set of services and service levels for provisioning those, and it enables me to report on those based on the provisions that are requested, the time to market, and the availability of services against a predefined time scale and service level. So it really controls, as a predecessor to building out this framework, the different components that need to fit into here from a service-centric perspective. Within GlassHouse, the approach we take to this is mapping out those services, looking at organizations and the opportunity that exists within traditional IT environments, analyzing the business case and service requirements for the different offerings. So what are my requirements to move from a traditional approach? What models suit me and what models suit my different applications? Because the reality we're seeing is that the hybrid approaches are fitting to a lot of our customers. It's not a case that one hat fits all. There will be some applications and systems that remain within traditional siloed approaches. There will be some that will sit within virtual footprints within the existing data centers. There will be candidates for the private cloud, and there will be candidates for the public cloud. So to understand the opportunity that exists within there, we look at those different applications, we map out the requirements and value they represent to the business, and we start to look at the business case and opportunities that exist within that. We then take that premise of the service provider model, once we've aligned the applications and defined the services, to build out those service requirements, start to look at the target states and architectures that support those, and go into the detailed planning for mapping around those. But it's that service provider model up front that's defining the selection and processes to drive the correct adoption of not only models, but technologies within models for virtualization and different service provider models behind that. We then take that and move it into the technology selection and tool build out based on a premise of an application-centric framework that will mean once we've built out those different models, we've aligned the applications to those correctly, we can then migrate them in a controlled fashion into those arenas as we have the mapping of those applications into the service levels in the service provider model. So that's everything from me, and I think we're now going to questions.
Does anyone have any questions for Simon? If you think of any questions after the webcast, you can send those to me, and I will make sure that Simon follows up with you. I have one question. As this evolves, how will the skills needed in IT change?
So again, Tyler, so I didn't hear you.
The question is, as this evolves, how will the skills needed in IT change?
Skills. So I think from a skills perspective, IT has been very much based around having people who have knowledge from an architecture perspective, have knowledge around specific technological components to build out those project requirements. IT are going to have to get better at interacting with the business and understanding and translating those business requirements more effectively. They're then going to have to get better also at managing third parties. So a lot of IT organizations have, up until now, worked in silo environments. They've worked at the service levels they've defined, and they've had some interaction with third-party providers from either a consulting perspective or a support escalation perspective. They're now going to be reliant on those third parties to provide the level of service. They're going to have to get very concise and clear at mapping out what their service level requirements are and articulating those in a contractual format so they can ensure that they as an organization continue to deliver the levels of service that they've committed to their organization. Because even though IT can start to leverage these models, that doesn't mean they outsource the responsibility for doing so. And really the governance should remain in-house, with IT leveraging the ability to increase its agility and time to market and reduce its price point through the use of different cloud models to deliver those services. But as that responsibility is still there, they need to ensure that they very effectively communicate and manage and report on those services with their third parties who are supporting the provision of those.
Okay, and a follow-up question is, today users have to work with IT, but if they don't get it quite right, they can work with IT for free to fix the problems in their initial requirements. When they start using third parties, how badly could they get burned by making choices based on incomplete requirements?
So I've got a couple of colleagues here. I'm going to open up to them afterwards. I've got Dick Benson and Steve Sexton also. But from my perspective, and this is a significant area of concern that we're seeing, if as an end user I can start to go out and acquire some space, let's say within Amazon or Rackspace or any of the providers that are out there at the moment, I can provide some compute power, I can set up some compute power very quickly, and I can do so out of the control of IT. And that really means I can get away from that frustration I've had for the traditional wait time of IT, but it now means that there's no governance around the level of service I'm getting, and there's also the security risk around putting my data into the control of someone else. So from an end user perspective, that risk is substantially increasing because I've got to make a judgment call as to whether I'm now housing my data in a secure environment and I'm housing it on an environment where the level of resilience that occurs around there is in line with what I need. Traditionally, I've had IT work that out with me. I'm now making that judgment call on my own, and I'm relying on my own knowledge to ensure that the service level that I'm signing up for is correct. I've also got the challenge that, even if that's just development data that's going in there, at what point does my development data start to become very critical and of high value to the organization? At what point I want to start to perhaps bring it back in as it gets towards the end of those development cycles internally, and how do I bring it in? So I'm moving away from my traditional reliance on the governance that IT experts would provide and taking a lot of judgment myself as to whether I'm moving it to the correct provider, and then how I in-source that data once again if I need to after it's reached a sufficient level that I want to do so.
Yeah, this is Dick Benton. I think this is related to the previous question too. What are the skills that IT need? And so let me just run through that and then move into this question. I think primarily IT is going to do a much better job of having a dialogue with the consumers instead of operating from the trenches or behind the barricades. Secondly, we're seeing consistently many organizations are battling to get the level of virtualization skills needed for the model they're driving to. And just about every organization is having difficulty pulling out of their environment the key performance indicators and the unit costs of the service that they deploy. And understanding those metrics and that cost are key, because what's happening is before a user or a consumer goes and bypasses IT, they probably bypass IT because they don't want to go through all the bureaucracy of moving through IT. But with the new model, the provisioning should be substantially automatic, and they will know the unit cost and they will have service level agreements. So those who are moving outside of IT to get contracted services will typically be looking for burst type services to handle a peak workload for a short time. And if IT has developed an adequate consumer relationship, then they can work with them to ensure that the service provider they're looking to can provide the services that they need at the right levels of security. And more importantly, that they have a backout strategy to get their data out if they want to. And part of that, of course, means that they need to understand the service catalog attributes provided by the provider and the dollar costs. And at that point in time, one might expect that they'd also have a look at the internal service catalog and its costs. And if we assume that they're not too unequal, the issue is they move outside to handle a burst workload, and there's a price to pay for having that access to a sudden peak load. But that's, I think, how those two aspects really come together.
Yeah, I think just one final point, this is Steve, that really becomes another need for IT to really start to take hold of, is really start to further educate their business customer around some of those things that they know near and dear because they live it in every single day, such that if someone is going to look to get some application service from a third party, sometimes you got to go slow to move fast. And what you don't want is somebody taking something that has that level of criticality to the business or regulatory concerns, data security, you name it, and get into a situation where it does create exposure. So part of what IT really needs to do from a governance standpoint, whereas traditionally there's been a little bit of the throw it over the wall type of mentality and we'll go build it, is really extend further into the business and help from an education standpoint to start to find that middle ground and define what is the mechanism to really start to identify between what has been the legacy data center traditional IT build scenario to couple that with the cloud related opportunities, and that's probably the best way to think about it, that can then start to complement versus creating a situation where if a service can't be provided internally, that they just look to go some other place because that inevitably could result in challenges for the business overall and risk at that point.
Yeah, that's right, Steve. And one of the key components of this is the requirement for the service provider model to have the knowledge of the dollar cost of the deployable unit, and to make sure that if an end consumer goes outside of IT for those services, those costs are charged to the consumer and not to IT. Otherwise, you'll have a runaway budget-busting situation within about 15 minutes.
Yeah, I think, as we get into organizations, what is the role of enterprise architecture? Who owns it? How does it work across business and IT? Then becomes even more paramount in terms of how they just start to define what those mechanisms are going to be able to manage everything accordingly.
Okay, we have one last question. Can current cloud providers handle all applications or only the easy ones? And what's the implication?
Yeah, I mean, interesting question. I think it comes very much down to how you as an organization use your application and the type of data you put into it and where you house it. I mean, if you're talking about a software or a platform as a service, no. If you're talking about just adopting infrastructure as a service and you can house your applications on that and it can manage the compute process power that you need, there's an argument that could be said theoretically that could be the case. I think it very much depends, though, on from an internal perspective, you know, what's the value and type of that data, and how do you see using it in the cloud? If you're saying, can platform and software as a service handle every application out there at the moment, then absolutely not. If you're just going to house it on infrastructure that is provided by someone else, and you're going to run and maintain it, then that gives far more flexibility around that.
I think all of this really is right in the zone of how we look at the application portfolio relative to business criticality and the risk you want to assume. So naturally, as you're starting to really understand what service can be provided by the various third-party cloud providers out there, like many things you would do, you would take a very cautious, well-thought, methodical approach as to which services you then start to procure, or which applications you have supported by a third party. And as you get more comfortable with that, then start to look at further options. But that's where having very good risk-based, business-focused strategy is going to be paramount as far as assessing potential providers.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have. Thank you, Simon, for running this webcast, and thank you, Stephen and Dick, for being on call to help with some of the questions. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us for today's webcast. As mentioned at the beginning of this call, we will be emailing you the presentation you saw today shortly. Should you have any additional questions, send them to me, and I will ensure Simon follows up. Join us next month when GlassHouse will be discussing the 5 challenges in managing virtual servers. Have a great rest of your day.